Welcome back, everybody. I'm Ruth McManus. I'm one of the editors of the Atlas, and I'll just be chairing this session. Our last session, Howard alluded to all of the connections with Cork, his favourite place, but our session's firmly back in Dublin, so we're a bit closer to home. Our three speakers are all gentlemen with very interesting backgrounds and diverse experiences in life. So I have very lengthy profiles of each of them, but I'm not going to go into that because in the interests of time, but you might interview them afterwards if you're curious. Brendan Twomey, who's a retired banker, has more recently come into the field of academia. He completed a PhD in Trinity and is currently working with the Visual Treasury as a postdoctoral researcher, which sounds absolutely fascinating. But for our purposes, he's speaking on Watering the Metropolis, Conflict and Controversy in Early 18th Century Dublin. So over to you, Brent.
Right, folks, can you hear me? Yep. So, well, this is going to be a bit less about engineering, maps and morphology. And going back to the Rowan Atkinson sketch about the father of the bride, we're going to look at who pays for it all is the main theme. So in 1738, going back to the Gilbert stuff that was talking about earlier, this was a minute that was noted during one of their meetings. We, the committee appointed to inquire into the demands that are on the city, find that there are about 3,000 over and above blah, 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 and that we don't have the money. So not surprisingly, as you can imagine, the city fathers were not too happy. And the question is, how had this disastrous situation arisen? Well, as we know, the city of Dublin had grown very significantly over the period from, say, 50,000 people a century earlier to over 140,000 by the middle of the 18th century. And this is just a map I did up many years ago, just kind of showing the expanding city as reflected in the different maps. Now, during this period, Dublin Corporation was the main body charged with the provision of a broad range of services for the city. And Dubliners, or elite Dubliners certainly, relished this. Sir William Fownes, former Lord Mayor and a friend of Swift's, proudly proclaimed in 1733 that Dublin was second in His Majesty's dominions. Swift had a rather different take on it, describing Dublin as the anus of the world at one stage. But it was nonetheless an expanding city. We have this Francis Place picture from the 1690s, and of course we have the famous drawing that goes with the Brookings map from 1728. Now, the governance of the city was in the corporation's hands. The corporation was a complex structure organized in a bicameral system with a sheriff, 24 aldermen, and up to 96 commons. And while it worked pretty well by and large, there were always complaints of, shall we say, an aldermanic oligarchy running the show. And this becomes a big issue at the end of my paper, particularly with the arrival of a reasonably well-known character, Dr. Charles Lucas, which we will come back to. So the city was run from here, the Tolsel. Now, some of this has been written up before, and these two books on the council and its works and pomps, and likewise the Gilbert details that were in 18 volumes. But it is on the internet, so you can search it by word within it. So it is possible to find the things. The services, as I said, included trade, security, street cleaning, disposal of domestic sewage, known to contemporaries as scavenging, street paving, lighting, but pipe water, as they referred to it, was the one that was both the most expensive, the most controversial, and central to the lived experience of Dubliners in this period. And in the early decades of the century, as I said, it was certainly the most expensive. So in 1721, a report to the City Assembly acknowledged that in the dry season, the city is in want of water, though at other times it runs much to waste. So following consultation with the Surveyor General, Captain Thomas Burr, proposals were made to develop a water source from the Dodder, and the city basin was built with reputedly up to 3 months' water at normal demand in it. These were circulated through a network of wooden pipes. Sorry, I'll go on one there. These are the wooden pipes, some surviving images of them, and one surviving pipe, imported from the Baltics. And there was down on the quay, and this is from the Roke map, down near the Gravel Walk and Hendrick Street, as you can see there, there was actually a slip to allow the pipes to be brought up, taken out of the water and put into a thing called the pipe yard. So there was a whole infrastructure around the water. And some of this has been written up, particularly in those two books, which have been published by Dublin Corporation. Now, there were always problems, as I've said. In 1719, there was a serious pollution problem from the Dodder, from a tuck and paper mill, which caused a scandal. Basically, the council bought off the owner, Adam Jackson, by paying him £100 to convert the mill to a corn mill, no longer polluting. Also, some, shall we say, landowners threatened, and it was mentioned in one of the earlier talks, threatened to block the water course if he didn't get his way in regard to some issues. So faced with the need to generate cash to fund such investment, the corporation made determined efforts to improve the collection of water revenue. And yes, folks, there were water charges in 18th century Dublin. Right? And they were collected, and you could be jailed if you didn't pay them. I won't go down that road any further. They increased the number of collectors from 2 to 3, and you don't have to read all of this, but the Gilbert record is full of records of all sorts of issues arising with the water bailiff. I've just isolated ones, a whole set of them from the 1720s. You could do the same from the 30s and the 40s, you guessed it, all the way through the century. Now, the costs involved in expanding the scheme were quite expensive. So, for example, in 1727, the city needed an immediate loan of £500 from the Bluecoat School, KH to you and me nowadays, to pay for a quantity of, quote, a quantity of timber that is daily expected for the use of the city pipe water. Now, that was easy for them to arrange because KH was a creature of Dublin Corporation at that time. In fact, the bookkeeper, these are the nerdy things you get to know when you do work in this space. The bookkeeper for KH was the same as the bookkeeper for the corporation. So wheels within wheels. In 1731 and again in 33, the city's MPs, Samuel Burton, the banker, and Sir John Rogerson, as in the key, made unsuccessful attempts to secure parliamentary support for grants to Dublin. They looked to the Exchequer for help. With no luck, money only arrived in 1775. The problems with the provision persisted, and finally, in 1735, the council organised the printing of 2 reports on what should or could be done. One by Gabriel Stokes, a leading surveyor, and the other by the up-and-coming architect Richard Castle. A sort of early version of a consultative process. They put them out there, they gave them away to get people's opinions. And the reports are quite good. They make for good reading. They talk about which streets have water and which ones don't. They talk about the cost of doing it. This is, if I recall, I think this is not Stokes, it's Castle's estimate at £4,000. It's interesting, some of the streets that didn't have water included Henrietta Street. It's on a hill, and this was a gravity system, so it struggled to feed that. And again, there's loads of information on the cost of doing all the different things. Again, by the late 30s, notwithstanding all of this, still nothing had been done. And as I mentioned earlier, they were running out of money. So here's where the money comes in. In order to raise the money immediately, the city agreed to sell a life insurance annuity of £100 to a Ruth Corker if she gave them £1,000 up front. And I'll come into the detail of that a bit later. That year, they also borrowed £1,500 at interest from a Richard Stevenson. Desperate times call for desperate measures. But finally, in August 41, in a bold move to sort it, the council agreed to pay £3,500 to purchase, get to the right page, the Mills in Island Bridge on the Liffey and install what they were calling a water engine. And again, sorry, I'm going to skip that slide. This is pictures of Island Bridge afterwards. And this is the sort of thing you're talking about as a water engine to help pump the water out of the river and into basins and so on. As you might suspect, the corporation did not have the money. So what they did was they gave Mr. Darby, who owned the site, $3,500. They gave him a bond. Basically, they gave him an IOU at 5% interest for his site. The new scheme got off to a rather bad start. And less than a year later, the Assembly was informed that the mills were in very ruinous and leaky condition and required immediate works. I can hear calls for an independent inquiry at this point. And in due course, it was this project that was exercising Lucas 20 years later in all his controversy. Lucas objected to nearly every aspect of the project: the location, the price, the role of an alderman, Nathaniel Kane, who I'll speak about a bit later, who he accused of a corrupt conflict of interest. And these two are just slightly out of order, but there's the minute to buy the thing for 3,000. But they did, to be fair to them, they recruited a Mr. Scanlon, who actually was competent and did run the place for the next 20 years to the best of the facilities he had available to. Now, in this period, the council incurred deficits most years. And but when it had a surplus, it would try to reduce its debts. But the debts mounted. There were £20,000 in the mid-30s, and there were £33,000 by 1758. And basically, it's based on these IOUs. The account ledgers for the council record the interest payments to those people. There were 35 individuals who had lent them money, and guess who they were? Ex-Lord Mayors, ex-aldermen, widows of ex-aldermen, executors of ex-aldermen, etc. Now, to be fair, the rate of interest was 1% less than the going rate at the time, as this was deemed to be a good security in that it was a semi-state liability. The corporation borrowed from a variety of sources, including Alderman Kane, which we'll come back to again just at the very end. Now, the council, to be fair, also tried to reduce the rate of interest. I don't have time to go into this one too much, but basically they tried to burn the bondholders at one stage. And what they said was, we're paying you 4% or 5%, but the market's now 3.5%. We're just going to reduce it to 3.5%. They were threatened with legal action and they backed off. But at least they were trying to manage the situation. The Ruth Corker situation was even more complicated. Basically, it's hard to know. She is the widow of an alderman. Her mother is married to, guess who? Alderman Kane. She has the £1,000. Don't know her age, but I estimate that when they do this, she's in her early 40s. The price on an annuity of 10% in your early 40s is 14 years purchase. She lived to her mid-70s, so she did rather well out of it because the £100 to her is still in the accounts 20 years later. It's us bankers look at things like that, right? And it's not as if they didn't know how to do this in this time. There were life tables, there were valuations, there were societies that dealt with that sort of thing. So finally, what shall we say? The chickens came home to roost eventually with the arrival of Charles Lucas. And in the 1740s, I'm going to skip that, it's just more evidence of the payments. In the 1740s, the problems continue and Lucas starts to create a rumpus about the problems. Now, Lucas has been, shall we say, valorized as a sort of saint of Irish national consciousness and so on. And there's some truth in that. But he was able to get down and dirty too in local politics. And this turns into a wonderful public spat that goes on for 20 years. At the height of which he is expelled. He has to go off to France for 10 years because he's causing so much trouble. He inundates the world with dozens, literally, of pamphlets about this and similar subjects, estimated at 400,000 words of political diatribe almost, repetitive, of course. But he does come back in triumph, and there's just an example of two of the headlines. He does come back in triumph and is elected finally as MP for Dublin City, at which point his acolytes, shall we say, in Dublin Corporation proposed that he receives a pension of £300 a year. It didn't pass, but so I'm just going to conclude with one point. And so it went on and on. Literally, these scandals, these issues continue right into the middle of the 19th century when Vartry, and in the Vartry has plenty of scandals involved with it too, when the Vartry is built to serve Dublin. So there is a scale behind the money and the politics of every one of the projects that we've heard about all day. The quays, the wharfs, the drainage, the canals. And that's what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for a fascinating, who knew the fascination of that story? And I'm just thinking about Charles Lucas and his 400,000 words, even without ChatGPT. So we move on and we continue looking at water supply with Phil Ryan, who is currently awaiting his Viva exam for PhD. But again, a very interesting background. I'll just tell you that he has sampled many different institutions because he has awards from DCU, King's Inns, Trinity College, and is currently based at Smart Lab in UCD. So his title is Water Consumption and Civilizing Processes in Dublin.
Well, we are going on and on. We are talking about Vartry when we get to it. Hi, I'm Phil. Nice to meet you all. And my paper is called Waters and Civilizing Processes in Dublin. This is an engineering drawing. I don't know who drew this. I have taken it from a book that was in the last presentation. We will talk about that. We have a 21st century Gilbert, if you will, which we will get to. Yeah, so to start off with, what is a civilizing process? I'm sure everyone has opinions on it. This is the academic side of it. I am trained as a sociologist. This is a project I was working on about 10 years ago when it was DIT. And I was taking the theories of Norbert Elias, little old man with the cup. He is a theorist from, oh, well, he died in 1990, but he was a theorist who came up with a form of sociology called figurational sociology. We're going to go through that in the next slide. It was inspired by looking at Annales' approach to history, and he specifically looked at Manners' books in his most famous work on civilizing processes, which looked at the work of Erasmus. Erasmus told everyone what to do, how to raise your child properly, how to wipe your nose, how to clean your we're not going to say that word. Can everyone hear me? Yes, they can. Yeah, so he used that to look at how things developed over time. I don't think this is that legible in the room, so we'll go through it. We see a little spiral here. We have a line that's time. I somewhat disagree with the idea that there's a linear version of time when it comes to civilizing. But in the theory that goes ahead, we have habitus being formed. So habitus, some people might know from Bourdieu. Bourdieusian habitus is much more Marxian. So it looks at changes of social structure, whereas Elysian habitus looks at the structures of social change, which is just a slight word change, but it does make a big difference. He is focused with how we change. And the way I explain this to people at parties is childhood became longer as society became more complex. There was more things to learn. There were more things to build up. And for me, water consumption is one of those things. By having a system that was going to every house, how we consumed the water was changed. And the conversation I'm having with the other presenters earlier, we have an idea of 17th century households that's built from 18th century households. We understand the consumption wrong. So with the atlas, with the historic atlas, it's allowing us to see a level of the world that's not being coming across in just textbooks. Yeah, so when I was doing this project, I was scanning the Dublin City Council minutes. The period I picked for the PhD project was 1860, which unfortunately is 13 years after the I would like a volume 4 of the Irish historical classes for Dublin, please. Can someone do that? That'd be great. Yeah, so I was going to Dublin City Council. They had not digitized the minutes. As of 2022, as I found out after signing up for this, they have digitized them. So I might go back to that at some point. But I had a little hand scanner. This was 2011, 2012, and I would go into the old books and I would get a dirty eye from Mary and I would scan through them. 1, 2, 3. Got a lot of kind of interesting things on how the business of being the Dublin Corporation changed. And you have to remember, so quite like the previous presentation, the mechanisms of what it was to govern the city changed vitally in the end. In order to have something on the scale of the Vartry scheme, so there's the Vartry scheme before that, we're using the canals, the basins. The Vartry scheme is using a larger reservoir. We have pressure within the city. We can get up the hills in Henrietta Street. It standardized the idea of having water in your house. Now, there was no needness in that. There were people who had more money, had servants to still do things, but things changed from there. Yeah, so what does that link in with walled towns? Sorry, yeah, walled towns, that is the correct term. This is a collection from a member of this house in 1904, collecting the known walled towns at the time. And what was important about the walled towns? It was how they were funded. The mertage, the taxation that allowed that to be brought in, was why those walls brought up. It was a form of security. And then in the 20th century, we moved from the form of security, so in the 12th century with the walled towns, they moved away from doing the walled towns and in other forms of securing themselves. From the 19th century, and then even 20th century, we moved to different versions of what security means. It means health, it means hygiene, it means building up the ability of the state to clean things. Yeah, and then each one of the maps in the Irish Historical Town Atlas collections, volume 1 to 3, show different versions of why those maps are being produced. So if we look at speed map is the first city one from the 17th century. That's for traders, that's for interest. When we get to things like the rock map, we have very beautiful, very powerful statements of the city, what the city is. And that develops in a way that doesn't always show the water consumption. But as someone who's interested in water consumption, I have to go into that source and try to find those. For me, again, this is our 21st century Gilbert. It means that you're usually going to a secondary source rather than the primary. Our good health was done by one of the members of Dublin City Council. He was retired academics, getting into history all the time. And he worked specifically on the resources that were within that water division of Dublin City Council. We can see here the piped water office. This is a version of it. I don't know where this is. So it was very interesting to see the collection of wooden pipes in the last display. This is one that I don't know if it was used. I don't know if it was not used. It's in the book as if it was. And then these are the versions of drains that were going on in the period. So we see the pipe there going in 1900. We had a brick ovoid in 1870s, masonry block. And it's a really great book if you get a chance. It's still for sale by Four Courts Press, €31. I know that we should be pushing Royal Irish Academy here, but it is very good for secondary sources. And a lot of things that I'm using here are that. Yeah, so Vartry scheme. Those reports that you were seeing in the last presentation were going on for quite a while. The one that starts the Vartry scheme is 1860. And that's taken part of by Park Neville, who we'll get to in a second. But the actual driver of it is a gentleman called Sir John Gray. He is a journalist, a politician, a bit of a Del boy, you might say. But he takes over the water committee in 1860, and then he is in charge of that until 1875. And as we were saying in the previous presentation, there is obviously some stuff going on. I have not gone into the level of detail of the previous presenter, but we do see the council thanking Sir Grey for providing them the land for the Bartry scheme. So somehow he owned land that happened to be where the largest bit of resource management was built up. And then we went on to Park Neville. Park Neville was the first chief architect of Dublin City Corporation. And he's responsible for a lot of these larger buildings that we see in the city, the grandeur of the Ivy Market, the now demolished City Arbitoire, and the Fruit and Veg Market. But he is in charge of the building out of what is a modern water system within the city. And eventually, so he passes away before it, but then the sewage system doesn't come in for another 30 or 40 years. And then we have Charles Cameron, who does survive until 1921, I think. He is the second chief medical officer of the city. He was the assistant to the first medical officer, and he is bringing in the scientific understanding of what disease is within the city. He's also a slumlord, just in case that is of interest to anyone. But he is driving the idea of a scientific version of health within Dublin City, a more modern idea of scientific health. And that's not possible without the water systems to come in to bring in that hygiene. Yeah, and then before we have Bartry, we were relying on basin water. This was going to be both presentations. The one in the middle, that is from the 1728 Brookings map. Wait, am I getting that word wrong? I keep saying, yeah, Brookings map, I am saying right. The other two are architectural drawings. Again, it's not clear who does these. I'm not clear how you actually access them outside of the book that I got them from. You see them come up every now and again. Dublin Port is using a very similar style in their displays on it, but again, wasn't able to find out at the time. And then the last basin, one that doesn't come up very much because it is a secondary thought, is the basin at the end of the Royal Canal here. Yeah, and then what does the city, how does bringing in this pipe water change the city? Some ways it does, some ways it doesn't. It is very uneven development. The clothing here is St. Albans. The St. Albans is very interesting to me because if you look at earlier the Gilbert's collection, you'll see that they were actually running a religious guild for one of the weirs that was collecting water for the city. Because it's a tidal mouth, it does come up that way. We have our Magdalen Laundries here. Starts off as a Church of Ireland structure, gets expanded out into Catholic Church. But that form of doing your laundry was much more attractive when you couldn't afford, unless you had a servant come in to do your washing for you. This kind of industrialized, more centralized idea of doing your laundry is separated from it. Here we have one of the courtyards. These courtyards would have pumps on them. This is very famous, brought up in, thanks so much, brought up in Snow's map of the Dublin city. By managing the pumped water, having individual and monitors, water quality going into the houses. The idea of contagion from diseases such as typhoid and cholera was reduced. But even then, like this is in the 1950s. My father will still tell me stories of his mother doing the pot on Saturday night for the once a week bath. We are constantly changing how we're consuming the water is interacting with the map because the map is ultimately the stories they're trying to tell. And then this is the things, it goes on and on and on. This is from when I was doing the research in 2011, 2012, very generously provided by David Ryan and the Dublin Corporation. You can see here, this is the interconnector, the new water supply plan from the Shannon. Extremely problematic in the Shannon, extremely necessary in Dublin. Here's a drawing we have from 1994 of shortages within the main system. Without saying it into public too much, the entire supply within Dublin is scary if you understand there is one connector that if it goes, you have extreme problems in Dublin. And that's been the same way for 15, 20 years. And we do vitally need to expand our water supply and increase its resilience, especially with the amount of building that we also need to do. So again, what am I trying to say with this? Maps decide what to show us and decide what not to show us. So to get back to the rope map idea earlier, this is a very beautiful map, but by showing this map, what was the purpose of it? If I went back to my great-great-great-granddad and handed him Google Maps, what he needed to get around the spaces that he's in, we understand maps as a navigational tool. At the time, how often would someone actually look at the map to go down the street? And what were they about? Were they more about that, or were they about prestige? So this one was done specifically for a royal visit. That's what it's linked to. Very beautiful map. It's showing the priorities of the people who can afford to do a map. And maps are always going to be political statements, even the ones that we use nowadays, where we go, oh, well, it's nothing weird about Google Maps. Google Maps is a large industry. It is training us to interact with that process. Yeah, and ultimately they're always plans. So this is the White Street Commission, which I thought would come up more often today. But White Street Commission, famously, how they were using the maps in order to change the beauty of the city, change the vision, to get closer to the Rook version as opposed to the living version of Cork, to take from the other presenter. And finally, you are here, I'm here. If you email me, you can get a version of this, which actually has the annotations, and maybe a week or two when I have a cleaned up version of this actual paper. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Phil. So we've had a perspective from a former banker, from a sociologist, and our third, last but not least, our third speaker, Colm Murray, who is currently undertaking PhD research at TU Dublin on Grange Gorman, but is also an architect and has a background in conservation, planning and public administration. So I'm really looking forward to this paper, which is entitled Floating Down into Dublin, 1818.
Thank you. So this is a byproduct of my PhD research for Grange Gorman Histories, looking at the psychiatric hospital and its antecedent institutions in the northwest of the city. And I'll explain how it impinged on my path, but my research path. But we'll start with this image, and we're going to be examining the role that water plays in an overlooked approach to Dublin at the Royal Canal Harbour, which is adjacent to the area that I'm studying. So conventional approaches to Dublin were from the sea and from the west. The archetypal image of Dublin is this kind of view of Dublin from the Phoenix Park. Strangely enough, the Liffey appears to be running westwards. And there are multiple drawings from the 17th and the 18th and indeed the 19th centuries. Like this one. Ooh, I keep getting this wrong. Yeah, this one by George Petrie, who also did the first image that you saw there. Now the canals, I think, changed this in a significant way in the early 19th century. So just a brief description of where the canals are coming from. The Royal Canal is the one we're going to be most interested in, but the Grand Canal also reaching towards the Shannon across Ireland's central rich agricultural heartland. The Grand Canal was long contemplated. It opened its first 12-mile stretch in 1779. Its terminus in the city was the city basin. I think I can, yeah, and I might be able to point that out now. We've been looking at descriptions of it in the previous two speakers' talks, but it's right over here. Am I seeing that right? Yeah. And it was there that the Grand Canal terminated for 17 years. The Royal Canal was commenced in 1790 and was planned to reach the Liffey. It spluttered into life in the early 19th century, linking Longford ultimately to post-Union Dublin after financial convulsions and engineering controversy. The Broadstone line was completed around 1808 and brought over Constitution Hill by the Foster Aqueduct to the Royal Canal Harbour sometime before 1811. You'll be seeing pictures of this now. Broadstone anticipated the arrival of goods and passengers into Dublin. With it came a hotel, an open inclined space for unloading goods, and warehouses would follow. Perhaps it was a jealous regard for the ambition of the Royal to reach the Liffey that the directors of the Grand Canal decided in 1791 to construct the complementary circular line to Ringsend in the south of the city. In the case of both the Royal and the Grand, the link to the Liffey was almost an afterthought. The canals were intended to link the interior of Ireland with Dublin, not with the sea. So, yeah. It is sobering that the ovoid shape of Dublin is given to it by a pair of canals that were branch lines. The difference in the shape of the city is marked by comparing Poole and Cash's map of Dublin in 1780 with that of Fadden, which is gone, from 1797, which is when our oval city emerged in the cartographic world. I thought I had that map there, I'm sorry. In an initiative overlooked by most of their historians, it was the Wide Streets Commissioners, who finally get a mention twice today, who set out the harbour at Royal Canal at Broadstone and what it would be like. Making this plan dated 1790, just as the canal was about to commence being dug 6 furlongs or 1.1 kilometres away to the north at Crossguns Bridge. For both the Royal and the Grand Canal, the business end of the passenger and goods trade was a terminus in the west of the city, City Basin in the case of the Grand and Broadstone in the case of the Royal. The involvement of the Wide Streets Commissioners in making plans for the Royal Canal Harbour should alert us to the urban design intentions implicit in the proposal. If we think of their work only in terms of streets and road traffic, are we not overlooking the great aspirations of the age to travel by canal? Until the first fast but horrible railways with their smoky and noisy trains effectively took over in the 1850s, the pleasurable way to reach Dublin from the rest of Ireland was by canal boat. During the French Wars, 1793 to 1815, opportunities for travel in Europe were curtailed by the British, who turned to Ireland for geographical adventure. This interest in tourism was serviced by guidebooks, which feature prominently as a source of evidence in what I'm about to show you now. Many of the images were presented to create an image of Dublin as a place to pique one's interest and perhaps also to orientate the traveller by pointing out places of interest in the city, to bring familiar nodes to the landscape. This inset map shows the condition around 1800 of the building of the canal, before the Foster Aqueduct brought it over Constitution Hill or Glassmanogue or the Glasnevin Road. In this, we see the stretch of water that provides the level on which one would float into Dublin. So the first lock to be built is just shown there to the top of the map. See it here? That's at Crossguns Bridge, as we call it now. And this is the stretch of water that traverses the contours of the city from a deep cutting to rooftop level. So it provides us with this image of a leisurely approach to Dublin. In this case, at the backs of houses on Glassmanogue or Constitution Hill or Glasnevin Road. So just to look a little at the economics of that and to map the reach of these canals on their hinterland. This is the area of Ireland that would have been serviced, or that it was imagined the canals would bring goods from or bring people to. which is quite a considerable area. I'm really struck by the presentation this morning about the ship canal in Tralee as a small countermeasure. And of course, these areas, Donegal, Connacht and West Munster were beyond considerability as places of economic interest or places where you might source revenue to build a canal. And if we look at that, that in particular might be the catchment area of the Royal Canal. To build it, and again, the theme of interests re-emerges. One of the principal sponsors of the Royal Canal was the Earl of Leinster, is it? The Duke of Leinster, and he insisted that the canal would pass close to Maynooth, which meant that it had to go for 1.5 miles through a very deep cutting in Carpenterstown, which nearly ruined it. They had to infill quarries, and the canal had to be taken 100 feet above the River Rye at Comfy and Leakslip and other major engineering feat, both of which add up to an incredible spatial experience of enclosure and grand vistas. So they added to the phenomenological view of what a canal could do. I think this isn't the deepest section of the canal, by the way. It comes from Google Maps. So this is the image that piqued my interest. I found this image and sought views of the buildings that I was studying. Oh dear. By Samuel Brocas, and I checked this against the city to see was it accurate, and those spires and domes line up, and it meant that I could trust what it said about the foreground buildings, the Hardwick Hospital, the Whitworth Hospital, and on the right-hand side the House of Industry. So we have a fascinating glimpse at what you would see when you arrived on the Royal Canal to Dublin. And I think this was intended. Now, the image has a history, and I think I'm missing a slide here as well, but I'll go on. This is the type of image that was used in 1811 in one of the guidebooks of how you would arrive in Dublin at Grand Canal Harbour on the branch line. And if we compare it to Brocas, we can see, well, we'll compare it to this image, which was produced around the same time. This is based on Petrie and believed, described in its subtitle as having been prepared for an 1811 publication, but produced and published in 1821, 10 years later, and some years after that Brocas image was produced, but it wasn't made public. So this is called a view of Dublin from the north. It doesn't refer to a canal. But by checking it against Brocas, we can see that it is in fact in the same place. The buildings align, the spires and domes align. So what on earth was George Petrie doing, drawing this particular place sometime around 1805? I think he was anticipating the arrival of the Royal Canal and presenting it as a potentially wonderful view or vista of the city. There's fascinating detail that helped me with visualizing and understanding the buildings of the House of Industry. I believe this building with the ladder against it is the two-storey lunatic cells of the House of Industry. The Royal Irish Academy here has the original Petrie monochrome watercolour, on which that print was based. And again, it shows a building site. This is the construction of the Royal Canal Harbour. Now, this is the area looked at in a little wider lens that the canal is arriving into, with the House of Industry in situ, built at that time, the lunatic asylum being built in the early years of the 1810s, and a whole series of other buildings that are hospitals and the poor house or the House of Industry in the foreground there. And I think this may have been a problem for the guidebook illustrators. So after 1821, they pulled back and they start providing images of the Foster Aqueduct. And so you have the phenomenon of horse and carriage underneath a barge. That's what you're seeing there. And the House of Industry, maybe that's that building, in that dark building in the top right-hand corner, and the Canal Hotel is there as well. The White Streets Commissioners were making changes to the roads in the area at this time as well. I won't go into that. This view of the Foster Aqueduct gets a bit fanciful. This is a drawing, well, I think I'll show you the next one. A guy called James George O'Brien, who left for London and changed his name to Oban because he believed that a more Germanic sounding name would yield him greater clients. But he romanticized this view of Dublin by including a view of the bay and exaggerating the mountains and this declivity down Constitution Hill. So it becomes quite, and of course, including thatched houses and so on as well. And you still have the barge above the carriage. Now, the building, the serious looking building that's abutting into Dublin Bay there, I think is an attempt to evoke this building, which ultimately becomes the frontispiece for guidebooks from 1825 onwards. And this is the King's Inns. And this is by diverting people's gazes away from the Western welfare complex of buildings in Grangegorman and to the east, to this wonderful Gandon architecture. I think they're representing the image of the city and the pleasure of arriving in Dublin in a different way. So this is the reality of the King's Inns now, with two wings added in 1847 and 1849 to the left and the right of the facade. And I'll finish with this slide, which describes an ancient route, Constitution Hill, which left Dublin, shall we say, and the canal, which made of Broadstone a place of arrival in Dublin by means of water and water levels, which in its turn was superseded by the railway in the 1847, 1850, which was a new way to arrive in Dublin. But that's a small snapshot of, I think, an overlooked way that water was used to impact on the city. So thank you very much, and let you know my research was funded by Grangegorman History Centre.
Thank you so much, Colm. That was really fascinating and sort of resonates, that whole business of building the image of the city in different ways resonates with some of our earlier papers as well. We have a very short amount of time, I fear, but enough for one or two questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question of any of our three speakers, we have the roving mic ready. And I see Kieran down at the back.
Thanks very much. It's just a general comment. Before I went in to be a councillor, like many historians, I'd kind of read accounts of, oh, this was passed, and you'd kind of be reading the list of councillors who were involved, and aldermen and freemen and all of this. But then when you become a councillor, you get to see that the dynamics of how they make decisions is just, it's like a 3D, 4D chessboard. I find, like, I'm 16 years an independent councillor in Cork, and it's interesting, like all the chats before a meeting, all above board, all positive, but people forming alliances, people forming grudges, social media pressures in our time, the general public kind of ringing you up, someone who owns land kind of ringing you up, trying to become your best friend. And it's just, when you're showing all of that and you're just commenting, the first two speakers in particular, the list of names, you can be guaranteed between every single signature there was a truckload of conversations, and that there's a human element to it as well. It's just a general comment. There's a familiarity. Cork had a water supply as well, a massive familiarity, but I just wanted to comment on the politics at play and the hours and hours of conversations and chats and people alliancing with each other.
Can I get that quickly? Yeah. So the PhD that's just been submitted is called bureaucracy mapping. It's specifically about this kind of thing. And then the previous one was very much getting that viewpoint of, like, there is a social process going on, even though we present that as completely absent. And the line, whenever I present my work, I'm always like, what about corruption? And for me, doing the job I do, one man's corruption is another person's informal arrangement. How we understand our society, we create this idea of this perfect way the institution should work, but usually that's pushed by the institution. Anyway, yeah.
No, I just agree totally. I mean, I have more the detail on the Lucas business is amazing. I mean, he really specifies where he feels Kane has been corrupt. In that Kane's bank, he alleges, is owed money by the landowner, and it's a sweetheart deal to redeem the bank. Rather than the correct technical solution for the. Now, the works did continue for 50 or 70 years. They had some issues over time, but they did work until, as Phil has said, until the canals provided the next level of water, and then the Vartree in the 19th century.
And you can't slander the dead. For the fame, it's the fame, actually.
Anybody else? Nobody else has a burning question. I think we'd like to draw this session to a close because we want to give a slight pause and maybe a little comfort break before our final plenary. But I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking our three wonderful speakers.